Elena's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table, the white lace of her wedding gown pooling around her feet like spilled milk. The music from the ballroom was loud, joyful, completely unaware that her whole world had just cracked in half. She had only stepped away for a moment, slipping past the kitchen doors to catch her breath after the first dance, when she heard two men speaking in low voices near the wine cellar. One voice belonged to Damien's uncle, the other belonged to Damien's business partner. She had not meant to listen. She had only meant to pass by, but the words stopped her cold. He needed her family's land more than he needed a wife, the uncle said, chuckling softly. Lucky for him she fell for it. Another year, and the company would have gone under. Elena's stomach turned to ice. She waited, frozen behind the pillar, praying she had misheard. But the business partner laughed too, low and knowing, and added, "As long as the marriage holds for 5 years, the deal is locked. After that, who cares what happens?" She did not remember walking away. She remembered only the sudden ringing in her ears, the way the golden lights of the ballroom blurred into streaks, and the terrible, hollow feeling that everything she believed about the last 8 months, the proposal in the garden, the promises whispered in the dark, had been nothing but a business transaction wearing the mask of love. She found Damien near the head table, laughing with his friends, looking every bit the happy groom. For one terrible second, she almost walked up to him and demanded the truth, but something in her chest told her that if she did, he would deny it, smooth it over, and she would believe him, because she wanted to. She could not trust her own heart anymore. Not tonight. So instead, Elena turned and walked toward the coat room, her mind working faster than her feet. She grabbed the first coat she found, not even checking whose it was, and threw it over her shoulders to hide the gown. She slipped out through the side door where the catering vans were parked, her heels sinking into the gravel, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. A cab was idling near the end of the driveway, dropping off a late guest. Elena did not think. She ran. "Please," she said to the driver, her voice cracking. "Just drive. Anywhere. Please." The driver glanced at her in the mirror, taking in the wedding dress, the tear-streaked makeup, the desperate look in her eyes. He must have seen this kind of thing before, because he simply nodded and pulled away from the curb without another question. Behind her, the mansion glowed with light and laughter, utterly unaware that the bride was gone. Elena did not look back. She could not. If she looked back, she was afraid she would lose her nerve and return to a marriage built on a lie, return to a man who had chosen her not for who she was, but for what her family's land could give him. 20 minutes later, sitting in the back of the cab with her wedding dress bunched around her knees, Elena finally let herself cry. Not the soft, pretty tears of a bride overwhelmed by joy, but the deep, ugly sobs of a woman whose entire future had collapsed in the space of a single overheard conversation. Her phone buzzed in the small purse she had somehow remembered to grab. She looked down. 14 missed calls from Damien, 6 from her mother, 3 from her best friend, Grace. She turned the phone off and slid it under the seat of the cab, as if that alone could sever her from everything she was leaving behind. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked gently, glancing again in the mirror. Elena thought for a moment. She had no plan, no bag, no money beyond the folded bills tucked into her purse for the wedding night tip jar. She thought of her cousin, Charlotte, who lived 3 hours away, in a small town called Ashford, a woman she had not spoken to in years, after a small family disagreement, but a woman who would never ask questions if Elena showed up at her door. "The bus station," Elena said. "The one that goes toward Ashford." The driver nodded and said nothing more. At the station, Elena bought a bus ticket with cash, still wearing her wedding dress beneath the borrowed coat, drawing more than a few curious stares from strangers waiting on the benches. An older woman offered her a tissue without asking a single question, and Elena took it gratefully, pressing it to her eyes as the loudspeaker announced her bus was boarding. She found a seat near the back, away from the overhead lights, and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window as the bus pulled out of the station. The city lights blurred past her, each one a small, twinkling reminder of the life she was leaving behind. The penthouse apartment Damien had shown her with such pride, the wedding planner's endless calls, the perfect future that had, in truth, never been real at all. Somewhere behind her, in a mansion full of flowers and music, Damien was likely searching every room for his missing bride, growing more confused and more panicked with every passing minute. Elena felt a small stab of guilt, quickly buried beneath the wave of hurt that had brought her this far. She told herself that a man who would marry her for land, who would smile at her and speak of forever while planning around a 5-year deadline, did not deserve her guilt. He deserved her absence. The bus rumbled on through the darkness, carrying her farther and farther from the life she had built, piece by careful piece, over the last year. Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion finally catching up to the shock, and let the motion of the road rock her toward an uneasy, fitful sleep. She woke as the bus pulled into a rest stop, the fluorescent lights of a gas station glowing harshly against the night sky. Her neck ached, her makeup was smudged beyond repair, and the wedding dress felt suddenly absurd, a costume from a play that had ended long before it should have. She used the last of her cash to buy a plain gray sweatshirt and sweatpants from a small rack near the register, changing quickly in the gas station bathroom, folding the wedding dress into a tight bundle, and stuffing it into the bottom of a trash can before she could change her mind. Looking at herself in the cracked mirror, hair falling loose from its careful pins, face bare of the makeup that had taken 2 hours to apply, Elena almost did not recognize the woman staring back. She looked tired. She looked frightened. But underneath all of that, she also looked, for the first time in months, like someone making her own choice. When the bus resumed its journey, Elena sat with her knees pulled to her chest, staring out at the passing darkness, turning the overheard conversation over and over in her mind. She thought of every moment with Damien that had felt real, the late-night conversations, the way he had held her hand at her father's funeral, the small kindnesses that had made her fall for him in the first place. Had all of it been calculated? Had none of it been calculated? She did not know, and that uncertainty hurt almost as much as the words she had overheard. By the time the bus reached Ashford, the sky had begun to lighten with the pale gray of early morning. Elena stepped off onto the quiet, empty street, the small town still asleep around her, and began the long walk toward her cousin's address, the only fixed point in a world that had otherwise gone completely unmoored. Charlotte answered the door in her pajamas, blinking in confusion at the sight of her cousin standing on the porch in an oversized gray sweatshirt, her wedding hairstyle now a tangled mess, dark circles under her eyes. "Elena?" Charlotte said, her voice thick with sleep and disbelief. "What on earth happened to you?" Elena opened her mouth to explain, but the words caught in her throat, and instead, she simply said, "I left him. I left everything. Can I stay here for a while?" Charlotte did not hesitate. She stepped back from the doorway, pulling Elena inside with a firm, steady hand, the kind of gesture that said questions could wait, but comfort could not. "Come in," Charlotte said softly. "You can tell me everything when you're ready. For now, you need sleep." As Elena crossed the threshold into her cousin's small, warm home, she felt the enormous weight of the decision she had made settle fully onto her shoulders for the first time. She had run from her own wedding. She had abandoned a life of comfort and certainty for a future that held absolutely nothing solid, and somewhere, back in that glittering mansion, a man was waking up to discover that his bride, along with the wedding he had spent a year planning, had vanished into the night without a single word of explanation. Elena did not know it yet, but this single, desperate decision, made in a moment of heartbreak and fear, would set into motion a chain of events that neither she nor Damien could have predicted. It would take 3 years, countless changes, and a chance meeting neither of them could have imagined, before the truth of that overheard conversation would finally come to light, and before Elena would discover that sometimes the very thing we run from is the thing we are destined to return to, once we have become strong enough to face it without fear. For now, though, she only wanted to sleep, to close her eyes and forget, for a few hours at least, that she had once been a bride, and that somewhere far away, a groom was standing alone in an empty church, wondering where his future had gone. Damien stood in the middle of the empty ballroom at 2 in the morning, still wearing his wedding suit, the bow tie hanging loose around his open collar. The last of the guests had gone home hours ago, whispering among themselves, throwing him looks of pity that made his jaw clench with humiliation. The catering staff had cleared away most of the food, but the flowers remained, wilting slightly under the lights, a cruel reminder of a celebration that had never truly happened. "Sir," said Nathan, his closest friend and best man, stepping carefully into the room. The hotel staff want to know if they should start breaking down the tables. Damien did not answer right away. He was staring at the empty chair at the head table, the one that should have held his bride, the one that had sat empty since the moment Elena disappeared without a trace. "Let them," Damien finally said, his voice flat. "There's nothing left to celebrate." Nathan crossed the room and placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We'll find her. Something must have happened. She wouldn't just leave without a reason." Damien turned to face him, his eyes red, rimmed with exhaustion and confusion. "That's exactly what worries me, Nathan. Something did happen. I just don't know what." He had spent the last several hours calling every number he had for Elena, checking every room in the mansion, questioning every guest who might have seen her leave. Her mother was inconsolable, convinced something terrible had befallen her daughter. Her best friend, Grace, kept insisting that Elena would never do something like this without a very good reason, though even she could not say what that reason might be. Damien replayed the evening over and over in his mind, searching for any clue, any sign that something had been wrong. She had smiled during their first dance. She had squeezed his hand tightly during the vows. There had been no argument, no tension, nothing that would explain why a woman would leave her own wedding without a single word. It was Nathan who finally suggested checking the security footage from the mansion's side entrances, and it was there, on a grainy black and white recording, that they saw her. Elena, still in her wedding gown, walking briskly toward the coat room, grabbing a random coat, and slipping out through the catering entrance into the night. "She was running," Damien whispered, staring at the screen. "She wasn't taken. She ran." The realization hit him like a physical blow. His bride had chosen to leave. Someone, had frightened her badly enough that she abandoned her own wedding rather than stay one more minute. Damien thought back through every conversation of the evening, every guest she might have spoken to, every moment she had been out of his sight. And then it struck him. The wine cellar. He remembered his uncle and his business partner disappearing toward the wine cellar sometime during the reception, the same hallway that led past the spot where Elena would have walked on her way back from freshening up. Damien's blood ran cold. He found his uncle the next morning, nursing a hangover in the hotel's private lounge, and demanded to know exactly what had been discussed the previous night. His uncle, still groggy and unaware of the disaster that had unfolded, casually recounted the conversation about the land deal, about the marriage clause tied to the business agreement, about how lucky Damien was that things had worked out so neatly. Damien felt the floor drop out from beneath him. It was true that the merger with Elena's family land had been part of a larger business arrangement, one that had been in motion long before he had ever met Elena in person. But it was also true, and this was the part his uncle and his business partner did not understand, that somewhere in the last 8 months, the arrangement had stopped mattering to him entirely. He had fallen in love with Elena for reasons that had nothing to do with land or business deals, for the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, for the quiet strength she had shown after losing her father, for the way she made even the most ordinary moments feel important. But if Elena had overheard that conversation, without knowing the rest of the story, without knowing how deeply his feelings had changed, then she would have every reason to believe she had been nothing more than a piece in a business transaction. She would have every reason to run. "I have to find her," Damien said, already reaching for his phone. "I have to explain." He spent the following weeks in a desperate search, hiring a private investigator, calling every friend and relative Elena had ever mentioned, driving to towns she had spoken of visiting as a child. But Elena had vanished so completely, so thoroughly, that it seemed as though she had disappeared into thin air. Her phone remained switched off. Her social media accounts went silent. Even her closest friend, Grace, claimed not to know where she had gone, though Damien suspected Grace knew more than she was willing to share. Months passed. The investigators' reports grew thinner and thinner, each one containing less information than the last, until finally the man admitted that he had exhausted every lead he could find. Elena Whitfield, it seemed, had simply ceased to exist. Damien's business partners, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated with his distraction. The company that had once been the center of his ambition now felt hollow and meaningless without the promise of a shared future to give it purpose. He began missing meetings, delegating decisions he would once have handled personally, and spending long hours alone in his office, staring at a single photograph of Elena, laughing at something just out of frame, a photograph taken only weeks before the wedding, back when everything had still seemed possible. "You need to move on," his uncle told him one evening, several months after the disappearance. "Whatever happened, she's gone. You have a company to run, a life to live. You can't keep chasing a ghost." Damien wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Elena was not a ghost, that she was a living, breathing woman somewhere in the world, hurt and afraid because of something his own family had said carelessly at his wedding. But he had no evidence to offer, no location to point to, nothing but a growing certainty that he had failed the one person who had ever truly mattered to him. It was Nathan who finally convinced him to stop the active search, not because Damien should give up on Elena entirely, but because the constant, fruitless chasing was destroying him from the inside out. "If she wants to be found, she'll come back when she's ready," Nathan said gently. "And if she doesn't, chasing her across the country isn't going to change her mind. You need to become someone worth coming back to, Damien, not someone drowning in guilt." The words settled into Damien's chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. He thought of the man he had been before Elena, ambitious, sometimes careless with the feelings of others, more concerned with the success of his company than the people affected by his decisions. He thought of the uncle whose careless words had cost him everything, and he realized that he had allowed that same careless approach to business, that same willingness to let deals and arrangements shape his life, to nearly ruin the one relationship that had ever felt genuinely important. That night, standing alone on the balcony of the penthouse apartment he and Elena had once toured together with such excitement, Damien made a quiet, private decision. He would stop searching for her, at least for now. But he would spend every day that followed becoming a different man, a man who valued honesty over convenience, who protected the people he loved instead of letting outside forces threaten them, and who, if fate ever gave him a second chance, would be ready to take it without hesitation. He did not know if Elena would ever return. He did not know if she was even thinking of him at all, wherever she had gone. But he knew that the man who had let her run from her own wedding, blindsided by a conversation he had never meant for her to overhear, was not the man he wanted to remain. And so, with a heavy heart and a fragile hope, Damien began the long, uncertain work of rebuilding himself, piece by piece, in the hope that somewhere, someday, Elena might find her way back to him. Ashford was nothing like the city Elena had grown up in. There were no towering glass buildings, no valet parking, no doorman greeting her by name. Instead, there were quiet streets lined with old oak trees, a single bakery that opened at dawn, and neighbors who waved from their porches without expecting anything in return. For the first few weeks, Elena barely left Charlotte's small house, too exhausted and heartbroken to face the world outside. Charlotte, true to her nature, did not push for explanations. She simply made tea every morning, left the newspaper on the table in case Elena wanted a distraction, and waited patiently for her cousin to be ready to talk. It was nearly 2 weeks before Elena finally told her the full story, sitting at the small kitchen table, with a mug growing cold in her hands, the words tumbling out in a rush she could no longer contain. "He was using me," Elena said, her voice breaking. "The whole thing, the proposal, the wedding, all of it, was about my family's land. I heard them talking about it, Charlotte. His own uncle called it lucky that I fell for it." Charlotte listened without interruption, her expression a careful mixture of sympathy and quiet anger. When Elena finished, Charlotte reached across the table and took her cousin's hand. "You did the right thing," Charlotte said firmly. "No woman should have to marry into a lie. You're safe here, for as long as you need." It was those words, spoken with such simple certainty, that gave Elena the first small foothold of stability in a life that had otherwise collapsed entirely. She began to sleep through the night without waking in a panic. She began to eat proper meals instead of picking at her food out of habit. And slowly, cautiously, she began to think about what her future might look like without Damien in it. Money, however, quickly became a pressing concern. Elena had left the wedding with nothing but a folded handful of cash and the clothes she had bought at the gas station. She refused to touch the joint accounts she and Damien had opened in preparation for married life, unwilling to take even a single dollar from a man she now viewed as a stranger wearing a familiar face. Charlotte offered to help, but Elena, proud and determined not to become a permanent burden, insisted on finding work of her own. The first job she found was at a small diner on the edge of town, waiting tables for tips that barely covered her share of the household expenses. It was humbling work for a woman who had once been fitted for a designer wedding gown, but Elena found, to her own surprise, a strange kind of comfort in the simplicity of it. No one at the diner knew her as the runaway bride. No one looked at her with pity or curiosity. She was simply Elena, the new waitress who remembered regular customers' orders and always had a kind word for tired truck drivers passing through. The diner's owner, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Grace Whitmore, though not the same Grace from Elena's old life, took a particular liking to her new employee. It was Grace who first suggested that Elena consider night classes at the community college a few towns over, noting the careful, thoughtful way Elena handled the diner's books whenever the regular bookkeeper called in sick. "You've got a good head for numbers," Grace told her one slow afternoon, wiping down the counter. "Waitressing is fine, but it's not going to get you very far. Ever think about doing something with that brain of yours?" Elena had never seriously considered continuing her education. Growing up, her family's expectations had always centered on marriage and social standing rather than career ambitions. But something about Grace's blunt encouragement sparked a small flame of curiosity, and within a month, Elena had enrolled in evening accounting classes, splitting her days between diner shifts and textbooks. The work was hard. Between the diner, the classes, and the small apartment she eventually moved into above the town's hardware store, Elena often collapsed into bed exhausted, her mind too tired even to dwell on the wedding she had left behind. But there was something deeply satisfying about the exhaustion, a sense that every hour she spent studying, every shift she worked, was building something entirely her own, untouched by Damien's money or influence. She made a few careful friends during this time, classmates from her accounting course, co-workers from the diner, but she kept most people at a cautious distance, still wary of trusting too quickly after discovering how completely she had misjudged Damien. When a kind, easygoing man named Oliver, one of her classmates, began showing clear interest in her, Elena found herself unable to reciprocate, no matter how much she genuinely liked his company. "I'm not ready," she told him honestly, one evening after class, as they walked together toward the parking lot. "There's someone in my past I haven't fully let go of, even though I probably should." Oliver, to his credit, did not push. "Take your time," he said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." Elena appreciated his patience, but privately, she wondered if she would ever truly be ready to trust another man with her heart. The wound Damien had left was deeper than she had initially realized, not simply because he had hurt her, but because she had genuinely believed, with her whole heart, that what they shared was real. Discovering that it might have been calculated from the start had shaken her faith not only in him, but in her own judgment. Late at night, unable to sleep, Elena sometimes found herself wondering about the parts of the story she had never heard, the explanation Damien might have offered if she had stayed to demand one instead of running. She wondered if there had been more to the arrangement than she understood, or if his uncle's words had painted an incomplete picture of something far more complicated. But every time these thoughts crept in, she pushed them away, reminding herself that a man who truly loved her would never have let such an arrangement exist in the first place, whatever the explanation might be. A full year passed in this manner, Elena slowly building a life defined by hard work and quiet independence. She finished her accounting certificate with strong marks, and Grace, delighted, offered her a permanent position managing the diner's finances alongside her waitressing duties, a small but meaningful step toward greater stability. It was during this time that Elena finally allowed herself to feel something close to peace. She was no longer the frightened bride who had fled into the night. She was becoming someone new, someone shaped by her own choices rather than the expectations of a family or the ambitions of a man who had once claimed to love her. She still thought of Damien occasionally, usually late at night when the town had gone quiet and her mind had nothing else to occupy it. But the thoughts came less frequently now, softened by distance and time. What Elena did not know, could not have known, sitting in her small apartment above the hardware store, carefully balancing the diner's books by lamplight, was that nearly 300 miles away, the man she had fled was undergoing his own quiet transformation, driven by guilt and hope in equal measure, working toward becoming someone worthy of a second chance he was not even certain he would ever receive. For now, though, Elena's world remained small and self-contained, bordered by diner shifts and textbooks, and the comforting presence of her cousin down the street. She had survived the collapse of her old life. She had built, brick by careful brick, a new one. And though she did not yet know it, this quiet, unremarkable stability was preparing her for a future far more extraordinary than she could have imagined. A future that would eventually lead her back to the very city, and the very man, she had once fled in the middle of the night. 6 months after the wedding that never finished, Damien sat across from his company's board of directors, listening to numbers and projections that should have mattered a great deal to him, but somehow felt distant, almost unreal. His company, Cole Industries, had weathered the scandal of the disappeared bride reasonably well in the public eye, with careful public relations work framing the situation as a private family matter. But internally, Damien knew that his own distraction had cost the company real momentum. "We need a decision on the northern expansion by the end of the month," said his chief financial officer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya. "The investors are getting impatient, Damien. We can't keep delaying." Damien nodded, forcing his attention back to the meeting. "Send me the full proposal tonight. I'll review it properly this time." After the meeting ended, Nathan lingered behind, watching his friend gather his papers with a slower, more deliberate pace than he had shown in the months immediately following the wedding, when Damien had moved through his days like a man sleepwalking. "You seem different," Nathan observed. "Better, actually." Damien allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I've been trying. It's slow, but I think I'm finally starting to remember who I was before all of this, before the company became the only thing that mattered." It was true. In the months since he had made his quiet, private decision on the penthouse balcony, Damien had thrown himself into a kind of deliberate self-reflection that surprised even those who knew him best. He began attending therapy sessions, initially reluctant and skeptical, but gradually finding real value in confronting the parts of himself that had allowed the land deal arrangement to exist in the first place, the ambition that had once overshadowed his ability to see how his actions might affect the people around him. He also began repairing relationships he had neglected during his years of relentless business focus. He reconnected with his younger sister, Sophie, whom he had barely spoken to in years beyond obligatory holiday calls, and found in her a source of honest, unfiltered feedback that no employee or business partner would ever have dared offer him. "You were always like this, you know," Sophie told him one evening over dinner, several months into his transformation. "Even before Elena, you treated people like pieces on a board. I love you, but it's true." The words stung, but Damien did not argue. Instead, he asked her to keep being honest with him, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. It was a small request, but one that marked a significant shift from the man he had been only a year earlier, a man who had surrounded himself with people who told him only what he wanted to hear. He also confronted his uncle directly, a conversation that had been a long time coming. He told the older man plainly that his careless words at the wedding had cost Damien the woman he loved, and that he expected, from that point forward, complete honesty and restraint in how business matters were discussed, especially anything touching on his personal life. "I never meant for her to hear that," his uncle said, genuinely remorseful once the full weight of the situation became clear to him. "I didn't realize how much things had changed for you, Damien. I still saw the arrangement as it was originally intended, not as it had become." "That's exactly the problem," Damien replied. "You saw an arrangement. I saw a woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Those were never supposed to be the same thing, and I should have made that clearer from the very beginning." The conversation did not undo the damage that had been done, but it did mark an important turning point, a clear line drawn between the business-minded family culture Damien had grown up in and the kind of man he was determined to become. He began restructuring several long-standing business practices at Cole Industries, moving away from the kind of transactional relationships and marriage-adjacent business arrangements that had defined his family's approach for generations, and toward a more transparent, values-driven model that better reflected who he wanted to be. The northern expansion proposal that had been sitting on his desk for weeks became, in his hands, an opportunity to demonstrate this new philosophy. Rather than pursuing an aggressive, land-grabbing strategy that would have benefited the company financially, but displaced several small local farms in the process, Damien proposed a partnership model that gave the affected landowners a genuine stake in the expansion, a decision that cost the company some short-term profit but earned it significant goodwill in the communities where it operated. "This isn't how we usually do things," Priya said carefully, reviewing his revised proposal. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," Damien said. I spent a long time thinking that success meant getting the best deal, no matter the cost to the people on the other side of the table. I don't want to build my company that way anymore. The board approved the revised proposal, somewhat reluctantly, and over the following months, Damien watched with quiet satisfaction as the northern expansion proceeded smoothly, without the resentment and legal battles that had accompanied similar projects under the company's previous leadership. It was a small victory, but one that felt more meaningful to him than any deal he had closed in the years before Elena. Despite this progress, the ache of her absence never fully disappeared. Damien kept her photograph in his desk drawer, no longer displayed openly on his desk as it had once been, but still close at hand, a private reminder of what he had lost and what he hoped, someday, to regain. He resisted the urge to hire another investigator, honoring the promise he had made to himself and to Nathan that he would stop actively chasing her. But he could not stop himself from wondering, late at night, where she was, whether she was safe, whether she ever thought of him at all. His sister Sophie, observing this quiet longing, finally broached the subject directly one evening, as they sat together on his balcony, the same balcony where he had made his private vow so many months earlier. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Sophie asked gently. Damien considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I don't know, but I think, if she does, I want to be ready. Not the same man who let her walk into a marriage without knowing the whole truth, but someone she could actually trust." "And if she never comes back?" "Then at least I'll have become someone better," Damien said quietly, "even if it's too late to matter to her." Sophie reached over and squeezed his hand, a small gesture of support that meant more to him than she likely realized. It was in moments like these, surrounded by the people who genuinely cared about him rather than what he could offer them, that Damien felt most confident in the path he had chosen, even without any certainty of where it might eventually lead. As the second year following the wedding began, Damien's transformation had become widely noticed within his social and professional circles. Colleagues who had once described him as ruthless now spoke of his fairness. Employees who had once feared his temper now respected his patience. Even his uncle, initially resistant to the changes Damien had implemented, began to admit, grudgingly, that the company's reputation had genuinely improved. But Damien knew, in the quiet moments when no one else was watching, that all of this growth had been born from loss, from the empty chair at his wedding reception, from the woman who had run into the night rather than stay and become part of a lie. He did not know if he would ever see Elena again. He did not know if the man he had become would even matter to her, if their paths ever crossed. But he continued the work regardless, because for the first time in his adult life, he was building himself into someone he could genuinely respect, independent of whether it ever earned him a second chance at love. By the middle of the second year in Ashford, Elena had settled into a rhythm of life that felt, for the first time since the wedding, genuinely her own. She had moved out of the small apartment above the hardware store and into a slightly larger place a few streets over, one with a proper kitchen and enough space for the small collection of books she had slowly accumulated during her accounting studies. Grace had officially promoted her to full-time bookkeeper and assistant manager at the diner, a role that gave her steady hours and, for the first time in years, a genuine sense of professional pride. It was around this time that Elena received an unexpected phone call that would set in motion the next major shift in her life. A regional accounting firm, Whitmore & Barnes, had heard through a mutual contact about her careful work managing the diner's books, and the firm's senior partner, a sharp, ambitious woman named Claire Bennett, wanted to meet her for a potential position. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that," Elena said nervously, sitting across from Claire in the firm's modest but professional office. "I only have a certificate from the community college. I don't have a full accounting degree." Claire studied her for a long moment before responding. "I've looked at the work you did, reorganizing that diner's finances. Whoever taught you clearly knew what they were doing, but more importantly, you clearly have an instinct for this. Degrees teach theory. Instinct teaches judgment. I can work with instinct." The position Claire offered was for a junior associate role, handling small business accounts throughout the region, with the promise of further training and eventual certification support if Elena proved herself capable. It was a significant step up from diner bookkeeping, both in salary and in responsibility. And after several sleepless nights weighing the decision, Elena accepted. The work at Whitmore and Barnes proved challenging, in ways that pushed Elena to grow more quickly than she had anticipated. She spent long hours learning software systems far more complex than anything she had used at the diner, meeting with small business owners who trusted her with the financial details of their livelihoods, and slowly building a professional reputation, entirely separate from anything connected to her old life. Claire became something of a mentor during this period, offering not only professional guidance, but also a kind of no-nonsense friendship that Elena had not experienced since before the wedding. It was Claire who first noticed, several months into Elena's employment, that her new associate seemed to carry a certain guardedness whenever personal topics arose. "You never talk about your life before Ashford," Claire observed one evening, as the two of them worked late finishing a complicated audit for one of their clients. "I'm not asking you to share anything you don't want to, but I notice these things." Elena hesitated, then found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, sharing a condensed version of the story she had told almost no one outside of Charlotte. Claire listened without judgment, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. "That took courage," Claire said finally. "Leaving a life like that behind, starting over from nothing. A lot of people would have stayed, told themselves the lie was worth the comfort." "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice," Elena admitted quietly. "I never gave him a chance to explain. I just ran." "Does that mean you think you were wrong to leave?" Elena considered the question carefully. "No. I think I was right to leave that night. I couldn't have stood at that altar and said those vows with what I'd just heard ringing in my ears. But I sometimes wonder if I was wrong to disappear so completely afterward, to never even give him the chance to respond." It was one of the few times Elena had allowed herself to voice this particular uncertainty out loud, and saying it aloud made the feeling more real, more difficult to ignore. Claire, wise enough not to offer easy answers to a complicated question, simply nodded and let the conversation settle into a comfortable silence, returning their attention to the audit spread across the table between them. As Elena's professional life flourished, so too did her personal confidence. She began attending occasional social events organized by the firm, allowing herself to reconnect with the kind of professional, polished world she had once been part of, though now on her own terms rather than as someone's fiancé. She reconciled more fully with her mother, who had initially been devastated by Elena's disappearance, but had gradually come to understand, through careful, honest conversations, why her daughter had felt she had no other choice. "I always thought that family land arrangement was strange," her mother admitted during one visit, several months into Elena's new career. "Your father handled those details. I never fully understood the terms, but I remember him seeming uneasy about it near the end." This admission planted a small seed of doubt in Elena's mind, a suggestion that perhaps there had been more complexity to the arrangement than she had assumed on that terrible wedding night. But by this point, she had built enough distance from the situation, and enough of a new life for herself, that she did not feel the same urgent need to uncover every detail. Whatever the full truth had been, she reasoned, it no longer changed the fact that she had built something entirely her own in the time since. 2 years after fleeing her wedding, Elena received her official accounting certification, a milestone she celebrated quietly with Charlotte, Grace, and a small group of colleagues from the firm. Claire, beaming with genuine pride, announced during the small gathering that she intended to recommend Elena for a position at the firm's larger branch office, located in the very city Elena had once called home. Elena's stomach dropped at the suggestion. "I don't know if I can go back there, Claire. Too many memories." "The position isn't for another 6 months," Claire said gently. "Think about it. You don't have to decide tonight. But Elena, you've built something remarkable here. I think you're ready for whatever waits for you there, memories included." That night, lying awake in her small but comfortable apartment, Elena found herself thinking, for the first time in a long while, about the life she had left behind, about the mansion, the ballroom, the man she had once believed she would spend the rest of her life beside. She did not know, could not have known, that Claire's suggestion would eventually set her on a collision course with the very past she had worked so hard to leave behind. But as she drifted toward sleep, she felt, for the first time, that perhaps she was strong enough to face whatever that past might still hold for her, should their paths ever cross again. The decision to accept the transfer did not come easily. Elena spent weeks weighing the opportunity against the discomfort of returning to a city so thoroughly tied to the worst night of her life. She spoke at length with Charlotte, who encouraged her gently but firmly to consider the offer on its own merits, rather than allowing old fears to dictate her future. "You're not the same woman who ran out that side door 3 years ago," Charlotte reminded her one evening, as they sat together on Elena's small balcony, overlooking the quiet streets of Ashford. "You built an entire career from nothing. You can handle walking through a city that happens to hold some difficult memories." Elena also spoke with Claire, who was careful not to pressure her, but made clear that the opportunity, once declined, was unlikely to present itself again for some time. The larger branch office handled far more significant accounts, offered a substantial increase in salary, and represented a genuine step toward the kind of career Elena had never dared imagine for herself, back when her future had seemed limited to marriage and social obligation. In the end, it was a conversation with her mother that tipped the balance. "You've spent 3 years building a life you're proud of," her mother said during a weekend visit. "Don't let fear of running into one man in a city of millions stop you from taking the next step. The odds of you even crossing paths with him are small, Elena, and even if you did, you're not the same frightened bride anymore." Elena found herself agreeing, and within a month, she had accepted the transfer, arranged for a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the wealthy district where Damien's family maintained their properties, and begun the process of saying goodbye to the small town that had given her shelter during the most difficult period of her life. The goodbye to Ashford proved more emotional than she had anticipated. Grace hosted a small farewell gathering at the diner, insisting that Elena's old apron be framed and hung on the wall alongside photographs of the diner's history, a gesture that brought Elena to tears despite her efforts to remain composed. Charlotte, though sad to see her cousin leave, expressed genuine pride in how far Elena had come since that first desperate morning on her doorstep. "You came here broken," Charlotte said, hugging her tightly at the bus station, an echo of the very same station that had once carried Elena away from her old life. "You're leaving whole. That's not nothing, Elena." The city welcomed Elena back with an unfamiliar mixture of familiarity and estrangement. The streets she had once walked as Damien's fiancée now felt like the streets of a stranger's life, recognizable in outline but different in every meaningful detail. She deliberately chose an apartment in a neighborhood she had never visited during her time with Damien, wanting to build her new city life on entirely fresh ground, rather than layering it over old memories. Her new position at the larger Whitmore and Barnes branch proved demanding from the very first week. The clients were larger, the stakes higher, and the office culture considerably more competitive than the small, close-knit team she had grown used to in Ashford. But Elena found, to her quiet satisfaction, that she was more than capable of rising to the challenge. The instincts Claire had first noticed years earlier had only sharpened with experience, and within a few months, Elena had earned the respect of colleagues who had initially been skeptical of the small-town transfer with limited formal education. She made a handful of new friends in the city, most notably a warm, talkative colleague named Lily, who worked in the firm's marketing department and quickly became Elena's closest confidant in her new environment. Lily knew only the broadest outline of Elena's past, a difficult breakup that had prompted a fresh start in a small town, and Elena preferred to keep it that way, unwilling to relive the full story with someone she had known for only a few months. Life settled into a comfortable, if occasionally lonely, rhythm. Elena worked long hours during the week, explored the city's parks and museums on weekends, and slowly began to feel that her decision to return had been the right one, despite the initial anxiety it had caused her. She avoided, deliberately and carefully, any neighborhood, restaurant, or social circle that might carry the risk of an unexpected encounter with Damien or his family, a habit so ingrained that she barely noticed she was doing it. It was nearly 4 months into her new position when Claire, visiting from the Ashford office for a quarterly review, mentioned an upcoming charity gala that the firm had been invited to attend, an annual event supporting local children's hospitals that drew significant attendance from the city's business elite. "It's good exposure," Claire said, reviewing the guest list on her tablet. "A lot of potential clients attend these things. I think you should go, Elena. Represent the firm, make some connections." Elena hesitated, an old, familiar unease stirring in her chest. Charity galas of this scale had once been a regular part of her life with Damien, and the possibility, however small, that his family might be in attendance sent a flicker of anxiety through her. But she reminded herself of her mother's words, of the odds being genuinely small in a city of millions, and of the professional opportunity the event represented. "I'll go," Elena said finally, pushing aside her hesitation. "It's just one evening." She could not have known, standing in Claire's office, reviewing the gala's guest list with only mild curiosity, that the decision to attend would set into motion the very collision she had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. Nor could she have known that on the other side of the city, in an office far grander than the one she now occupied, a man named Damian Cole had already accepted his own invitation to the very same event, drawn by the very same charitable cause that had once been a favorite of his late father, entirely unaware that the woman who had vanished from his life 3 years earlier was about to walk back into it. As Elena left Claire's office that afternoon, already mentally reviewing which of her few formal dresses might be suitable for the occasion, she felt only the ordinary nervousness of a professional preparing for an important social event. She had no sense of foreboding, no premonition of what awaited her. She only knew that in a few weeks' time, she would attend a gala, make a few useful connections for the firm, and return home to the quiet, carefully constructed life she had built for herself, brick by careful brick, over the last 3 years. She was wrong, though she would not discover just how wrong until the night of the gala itself, when fate, having patiently waited 3 years for the right moment, would finally bring her face to face with the man she had once fled into the darkness to escape. The ballroom of the Grand Aurelia Hotel glittered with the same kind of golden light Elena remembered from countless events during her old life, chandeliers casting soft shadows across round tables draped in white linen, string quartets playing quietly in the background as guests mingled with glasses of champagne in hand. Elena had chosen a simple, elegant navy dress for the evening, understated compared to the sequined gowns worn by many of the other attendees, but she felt comfortable in it, confident in a way that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. Lily had come along as her guest, thrilled at the prospect of an evening among the city's elite, and the two women moved through the crowd together, Elena making careful introductions on behalf of the firm, while Lily charmed everyone within earshot with her easy conversation. "This place is unbelievable," Lily whispered, gazing up at the towering flower arrangements suspended from the ceiling. "How does the other half even function with this much money?" Elena smiled, but said nothing, old memories stirring faintly beneath the surface of her composure. She had attended events in this very hotel before, on Damian's arm, greeted by name by staff who remembered her from previous visits. She pushed the memories aside, focusing instead on the task at hand, securing a promising conversation with the director of a mid-sized manufacturing firm interested in restructuring their accounts. The evening progressed smoothly for nearly 2 hours. Elena exchanged business cards, discussed potential services, and allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of professional networking, the anxiety she had carried into the event gradually loosening its grip on her shoulders. She began to believe, with growing confidence, that her mother had been right, that the odds of an unwanted encounter in a crowd this large were genuinely small. It was during a brief lull, as she made her way toward the bar to retrieve a fresh glass of water, that fate finally intervened. Elena turned a corner near the edge of the dance floor, distracted by a message on her phone from Claire, asking how the evening was progressing, and collided directly with a tall figure moving in the opposite direction. "I'm so sorry," Elena said automatically, looking up to apologize properly, the words dying instantly in her throat. Damian stood before her, close enough that she could see the sharp intake of his breath, the way his entire body went rigid with shock. 3 years had changed him in small but noticeable ways, a few faint lines around his eyes that had not been there before, a certain gravity in his posture that spoke of hard-won maturity, but his eyes, when they met hers, held the exact same intensity she remembered from the night he had proposed to her in her family's garden. "Elena," he said, her name coming out as barely more than a breath, as though he could not quite believe what he was seeing. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The music continued around them, the crowd flowed past on either side, but the two of them stood frozen in place, 3 years of separation collapsing suddenly into the space of a single heartbeat. "Damian," Elena managed finally, her voice unsteady. She took an involuntary step back, old instincts urging her toward flight, but something held her in place this time, some quiet strength she had built over the last 3 years, that refused to let her run, without at least acknowledging the moment fully. "I didn't know you'd be here," Damien said, still visibly struggling to process her presence. I never expected." "I moved back to the city a few months ago," Elena said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded, despite the pounding of her heart. "New job. I didn't think our paths would cross." Damien's eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "You look well," he said quietly. "Really well, Elena." "So do you," she admitted, and found, to her own surprise, that it was true. Whatever changes 3 years had brought to him, they had clearly not been unkind ones. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of unspoken questions neither seemed to know how to begin asking. Lily appeared at Elena's side just then, sensing the tension immediately, and glancing between the two of them with obvious curiosity. "Everything all right?" Lily asked carefully. "Fine," Elena said quickly. "Lily, this is..." She hesitated, unsure how to introduce a man she had once been engaged to marry, a man she had fled from at the altar. "This is Damien, an old acquaintance." Damien's expression flickered briefly at the word acquaintance, a small wound crossing his features before he composed himself. "It's nice to meet you," he said politely to Lily, extending a hand. Sensing the tension between them despite the polite exchange, Lily excused herself after a few minutes, murmuring something about checking in with another colleague, leaving Elena and Damien standing alone, near the edge of the dance floor once again. "I need to say something," Damien said quietly, once Lily had disappeared into the crowd. "I've thought about what I would say to you, if I ever got the chance. For 3 years. I never expected the opportunity to actually happen." Elena's pulse quickened, old fear and cautious curiosity warring within her. Every instinct told her to make a polite excuse and walk away, to protect the careful peace she had built for herself. But another part of her, the part that had wondered, late at night in Ashford, whether she had been wrong to disappear so completely, without ever hearing his side of the story, held her rooted in place. "I'm listening," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien glanced around at the crowded ballroom, clearly aware that this was neither the time nor the place for the conversation they needed to have. "Not here," he said. "Please, Elena, give me 20 minutes. There's a quiet terrace just past the east doors. I'll explain everything, and if you want to walk away after that, I promise I won't stop you." Elena hesitated, torn between the safety of walking away immediately and the nagging, persistent curiosity that had followed her for 3 years, the unanswered question of what exactly had been said and what exactly had been true on the night of their wedding. Finally she nodded, a small, cautious movement. 20 minutes, she said, that's all. Damien's shoulders relaxed slightly, a flicker of something like hope crossing his face for the first time since their collision. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's all I'm asking for." As they made their way together toward the east doors, weaving through the crowded ballroom in careful, deliberate silence, Elena felt the weight of 3 years pressing down on her chest, every unanswered question rising suddenly to the surface. She did not know what Damien would say. She did not know if she was ready to hear it, or what it might mean for the careful, independent life she had built in his absence. But for the first time since that terrible night in the wine cellar hallway, she found herself willing to listen, willing to face the past she had spent 3 years running from, rather than fleeing from it once again. The terrace beyond the east doors was quiet, lit only by strings of small white lights woven through the surrounding trees, the noise of the ballroom fading into a distant murmur. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening air was mild, a nervous gesture more than a response to any actual chill. Damien stood a careful distance away, giving her space, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, as though he was uncertain what to do with them. "I'll start from the beginning," Damien said quietly. "The land arrangement my uncle mentioned that night was real. It had been part of a business agreement between our families for nearly 2 years before I ever met you in person, arranged, originally, entirely for financial reasons." Elena's jaw tightened, old hurt rising sharply to the surface. So it was true. "Everything I heard was true. The arrangement was true," Damien said carefully. "But Elena, I need you to understand something important. When my father first proposed the arrangement to your family, before I had ever met you, I was against it entirely. I told him I wouldn't marry a stranger for the sake of a business deal, no matter how much the company needed the land. Elena stared at him, uncertain, waiting for him to continue. But then I met you, Damien went on, his voice growing quieter, more earnest. At your cousin's engagement party, nearly a year before our own wedding. I didn't even know, at first, that you were connected to the arrangement my father had been pushing. I just knew I wanted to see you again. It wasn't until months later, after I had already fallen for you, that I discovered the land deal was tied to your family. And you didn't tell me, Elena said, her voice tight with old betrayal. I should have, Damien admitted. That's the mistake I've spent 3 years regretting more than anything else. By the time I learned about the connection, I was already in love with you, genuinely, completely, in a way that had nothing to do with land or business. I told myself that if I explained the original arrangement, you would doubt everything between us, that you would never believe my feelings were real. So I stayed silent, and let the business side of things continue in the background, foolishly believing it didn't matter anymore, because my own reasons for marrying you had nothing to do with it. Elena felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, 3 years of careful composure threatening to crack under the weight of finally hearing the full story. But the clause, she said. Your business partner said the deal only locked in after 5 years of marriage. That sounds like exactly what it seemed to be, Damien. A business transaction. That clause existed in the original agreement, yes, Damien said. But I had already begun renegotiating it months before the wedding, trying to separate our marriage entirely from the business terms. My uncle and my business partner didn't know about those changes yet. They were still operating under the old understanding when they had that conversation at the wedding. If you had stayed, if you had asked me directly, I could have shown you the revised paperwork that night. Elena absorbed this slowly, the pieces of that terrible evening rearranging themselves into a new, more complicated shape. Why didn't you come find me and tell me all of this? You had 3 years. I tried, Damien said, his voice thick with old pain. I searched for months, hired investigators, called everyone I could think of. When I couldn't find you, I made a choice to stop the active search, because I realized that chasing you across the country wasn't going to fix what I'd broken. I decided, instead, to become someone worth finding, in case fate ever gave me the chance to see you again. I couldn't have predicted it would take 3 years, or that it would happen at a random charity gala. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of dishonesty, any hint that this explanation was simply a more sophisticated version of the manipulation she had feared that terrible night. But what she found instead was a rawness, a vulnerability that the old Damien, the confident, sometimes careless businessman she remembered, would never have allowed himself to show. You've changed, she said quietly, more an observation than an accusation. I had to, Damien said simply. Losing you showed me exactly what kind of man I didn't want to be anymore. I restructured how my company handles business relationships. I repaired things with my sister. I finally set real boundaries with my uncle. None of that undoes what happened, but I needed you to know that the last 3 years weren't wasted, even without you in them. A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the distant sound of the string quartet drifting from the ballroom behind them. Elena felt a confusing mixture of relief and lingering hurt, the explanation she had wondered about for years, finally within reach, but not offering the simple, clean resolution she might once have hoped for. I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago either, Elena said finally. I built a whole life without you, Damien. A career, real independence, real friendships. I'm not sure what it means that we've ended up here, in the same city, at the same gala, 3 years later. I'm not asking you to forget any of that, Damien said quickly. I would never ask you to give up what you built. I just needed you to know the truth, finally, after all this time. What you do with it is entirely your choice. Elena looked out over the quiet terrace, the city lights glittering beyond the trees, and felt the full weight of the last 3 years settle around her, not as a burden this time, but as a foundation, solid and unshakable, upon which she could finally decide what came next. I need time, she said finally. This isn't something I can process in 20 minutes on a terrace, no matter how honest your explanation was. I understand, Damien said, and to her surprise, he did not press further, did not attempt to argue or persuade. Take whatever time you need, Elena. I'm not going to chase you across the country again, but if you ever want to talk further, I'd like the chance. He handed her a simple business card, his personal number written on the back in careful handwriting, a far cry from the polished, professional cards he had once used for such purposes. Elena took it slowly, turning it over in her fingers, feeling the weight of the decision it represented. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for finally telling me the truth." "Thank you for staying long enough to hear it," Damien replied. As Elena walked back through the east doors, leaving Damien alone on the quiet terrace, she felt something shift within her. Not resolution exactly, but the first real opening of a door she had kept firmly closed for 3 years. She did not know, yet, what she would decide to do with the truth she had finally received. But for the first time since that terrible wedding night, she felt genuinely capable of making that decision from a place of strength rather than fear. The weeks following the gala passed in a strange, suspended state for Elena, her carefully ordered life now shadowed by the presence of Damien's business card, tucked away in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, a constant, quiet reminder of an unresolved decision. She threw herself into work with renewed intensity, taking on additional clients at the firm, staying late most evenings, using the demands of her career as a convenient shield against the questions she was not yet ready to answer. Lily, ever perceptive, noticed the change in her friend almost immediately. "You've been different since the gala," she observed one evening, as the two of them shared a quiet dinner at a small restaurant near their office. "Is this about that man you ran into, Damien?" Elena hesitated, then found herself, for the first time, sharing the full story with someone in the city, someone who had not known her before the wedding, someone whose perspective might offer a fresh angle on a situation she had turned over so many times in her own mind that she could no longer trust her own judgment. Lily listened with wide-eyed astonishment as the story unfolded, occasionally interrupting with soft exclamations of disbelief, but ultimately offering the same quiet, thoughtful support that Charlotte and Claire had shown before her. "That's an enormous amount to process," Lily said finally, once Elena had finished. "But Elena, it sounds like he genuinely tried to become a better person because of what happened. That's not nothing." "I know," Elena admitted. "That's exactly what makes this so complicated. If he'd stayed the same, if he'd shown up at that gala still the careless, ambitious man I fled from, this would be simple. But he didn't. So what's stopping you from at least talking to him again?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I think I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I open that door again, I'll lose everything I've built for myself, trying to become someone who fits back into his world. I worked so hard to become independent, Lily. I don't want to lose that." "Reconnecting with someone doesn't have to mean losing yourself," Lily pointed out gently. "Maybe it's possible to have both, the independence you built and whatever this is with Damien, if it's real." The conversation lingered in Elena's mind for days afterward, prompting her to reach out, finally, to Charlotte, seeking the kind of grounded perspective only her cousin could offer. Charlotte listened to the full account of the gala, the terrace conversation, and Elena's subsequent uncertainty with careful attention. "You've spent 3 years building a life around the assumption that he was fundamentally dishonest," Charlotte said thoughtfully. "But it sounds like the full story was more complicated than that. I'm not telling you to forgive him, Elena. That's entirely your choice. But I think you owe it to yourself to make that choice based on the complete truth, not just the fragment you overheard that night." It was this conversation, more than any other, that finally prompted Elena to retrieve Damien's business card from her nightstand drawer, turning it over in her hands as she sat alone in her apartment on a quiet Sunday evening. She thought of the man she had collided with at the gala, the visible changes in him, the genuine vulnerability in his voice as he had explained everything on the terrace. She thought, too, of the man she had built herself into over the last 3 years, independent, capable, no longer defined by anyone else's plans for her future. Slowly, deliberately, Elena picked up her phone and dialed the number written on the back of the card. Damien answered on the second ring, a note of surprise evident in his voice. "Elena," he said, "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you." "I wasn't sure either," Elena admitted honestly, "but I've had time to think, and I have more questions. If the offer to talk further is still open." "It's still open," Damien said, relief evident in his voice. "Whenever you're ready." They met the following weekend at a quiet cafe far from the wealthy district, where Damien's family maintained their properties, a neutral space, chosen deliberately by Elena, to avoid any sense that she was stepping back into his world, rather than meeting him on equal footing. The conversation that followed was longer and more searching than their brief exchange on the terrace had allowed, spanning nearly 3 hours as they worked through the details of the past 3 years, the choices that had been made, and the growth that had occurred on both sides of their separation. Elena asked pointed questions about the revised business arrangement, and Damien, true to his word, brought physical copies of the renegotiated paperwork, dated weeks before their wedding, clear evidence that he had indeed been working to separate their marriage from the original land deal terms even before Elena had overheard the fateful conversation. "I should have shown you this before the wedding," Damien admitted, sliding the papers across the table toward her. "I was so focused on protecting you from unnecessary worry that I ended up creating exactly the situation I was trying to avoid." Elena studied the documents carefully, feeling a complex mixture of validation and lingering sadness. The proof was real, undeniable, but it also underscored how differently things might have unfolded if Damien had simply been honest with her from the beginning, rather than trying to shield her from a truth she had every right to know. "I appreciate you showing me this," Elena said finally, setting the papers down. "But Damien, I need you to understand something important. Even if the deal had been exactly as innocent as this paperwork suggests, the fact that you kept it from me, that you let me walk toward marriage without full transparency, that's still a genuine breach of trust. I need to know that if we try this again, in whatever form that takes, you won't make that same choice a second time." "I understand," Damien said, meeting her eyes steadily. "And I promise you, Elena, whatever happens between us moving forward, I won't repeat that mistake. I've learned, the hard way, exactly what silence and secrecy can cost." Over the following weeks, they began meeting regularly, slowly, cautiously rebuilding a connection that neither of them fully trusted yet, testing the ground with careful conversations rather than grand gestures. Elena introduced Damien, gradually, to the life she had built for herself in the city, her career, her friendship with Lily, the quiet independence she had fought so hard to establish. Damien, in turn, shared the details of his own transformation, the restructured business practices, the repaired relationship with his sister, the ongoing work of therapy that had helped him understand the patterns he needed to break. It was not, Elena reflected during this period, a simple or immediate reconciliation. There were moments of tension, disagreements over how quickly to move forward, lingering insecurities on both sides that occasionally flared into difficult conversations. But beneath all of it ran a current of genuine effort, a mutual willingness to build something honest this time, rather than allowing old patterns of silence and assumption to repeat themselves. "I'm not the same woman who ran from that wedding," Elena told Damien one evening, as they walked together through a quiet park near her apartment, the city lights glittering in the distance. "If we do this, it has to be as equals. I won't be absorbed back into your world. I need my career, my independence, my own identity, fully intact." "That's exactly who I fell in love with," Damien replied, taking her hand carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she chose. "Not the version of you that fit neatly into my old expectations, but the real you, whoever that turns out to be, 3 years later." Elena did not pull away. Instead, she allowed her fingers to close gently around his, a small but significant gesture, the first tentative step toward a future neither of them could fully predict, but one that both of them, finally, felt ready to build together, honestly and carefully this time. 6 months after their conversation at the quiet cafe, Elena stood on the same terrace where Damien had first explained the truth behind their broken wedding, though now the trees were decorated with soft autumn lights, rather than the summer greenery of that first uncertain evening. The gala had returned for its annual season, and this time, Elena had chosen to attend not merely as a representative of her firm, but as Damien's guest, a decision that had once seemed unimaginable, but now felt, simply, right. The months between had not been without difficulty. There had been moments when old fears resurfaced, when Elena found herself questioning whether she was making the same mistake twice, whether trust, once broken so completely, could ever be fully rebuilt. There had been a particularly difficult evening, only 2 months into their renewed relationship, when Damien's uncle had made an offhand comment at a family dinner that echoed uncomfortably close to the words Elena had overheard 3 years earlier, sending her into a spiral of doubt that took days of careful conversation with Damien to resolve. "I need you to understand," Damien had told her that night, sitting across from her in her apartment, his voice steady, despite the tension of the moment, that my uncle's old habits don't reflect who I am now, or what I've built. I've already spoken with him about how he discusses business matters in front of family. This won't happen again. It was moments like these, the willingness to address problems directly, rather than dismissing Elena's concerns, that gradually rebuilt the foundation of trust between them, brick by careful brick, much as Elena had once rebuilt her entire life in Ashford. She continued working at Whitmore and Barnes, her career flourishing independently of her relationship with Damien, a fact that both of them treated as non-negotiable. Claire, delighted by Elena's continued success, occasionally teased her about the unexpected turn her personal life had taken, though always with genuine warmth rather than judgment. Lily, too, had become fast friends with Damien over the following months, her initial wariness gradually giving way to genuine approval as she witnessed, firsthand, the careful, respectful way he treated Elena, always prioritizing her comfort and independence over his own convenience. "I have to admit," Lily said one evening, as the three of them shared dinner together, "when Elena first told me the whole story, I wasn't sure this would work out. But watching you two now, I think maybe some stories really do get second chances." Damien's sister Sophie, too, had grown close to Elena over the intervening months, the two women bonding over shared observations about Damien's occasionally stubborn nature, offering each other knowing looks whenever he fell into old patterns of trying to solve problems through decisive action, rather than patient conversation. "He's better than he used to be," Sophie told Elena, during one particularly candid conversation. "But he's still a work in progress. I think you're good for him, though. You don't let him get away with the things the rest of us used to overlook." Now, standing together on the terrace as the gala continued behind them, string lights glowing softly against the darkening autumn sky, Damien turned to face Elena with an expression she recognized immediately, the same nervous intensity he had shown on this very spot 6 months earlier, though the source of his nerves tonight was clearly very different. "Do you remember what I told you here, the first time we talked properly?" he asked quietly. "That you'd become someone worth finding," Elena said softly, "in case fate ever gave you a second chance." "I meant every word," Damien said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "But I realize now that becoming someone worth finding wasn't really the goal. The goal was becoming someone worth choosing, freely, without any business arrangement or family expectation attached to it. Someone you could choose, Elena, not because circumstances pushed you toward it, but because you genuinely wanted to." He opened his hand to reveal a small, simple ring, far less ostentatious than the elaborate diamond he had once presented to her in her family's garden, a design Elena recognized immediately as one she had once admired in passing, months earlier, during an idle conversation about jewelry that she had barely remembered having. "I'm not asking you to marry me because our families expect it, or because it makes sense for anyone's business interests," Damien said, his voice steady despite the visible emotion beneath it. "I'm asking because over the last 6 months, I've watched you build a life that has nothing to do with me, a career you're proud of, friendships that matter to you, an independence I deeply respect, and somehow, in the middle of all that, you still chose to let me back in. I don't take that for granted, Elena. I never will." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, not the panicked, heartbroken tears of that terrible wedding night 3 years earlier, but something entirely different. A quiet, overwhelming joy, grounded in the hard-won understanding of exactly what she was choosing, and why. "3 years ago, I ran from this exact question," Elena said softly, "because I was terrified of losing myself in someone else's plans for my future. But I'm not that frightened bride anymore, Damien. I know exactly who I am now. Independent of you, independent of anyone. And knowing that, choosing you, choosing this, feels completely different this time." "Is that a yes?" Damien asked, a hopeful smile breaking across his face. "It's a yes," Elena said, laughing through her tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "But on my terms this time. No secret arrangements, no business deals disguised as romance, complete honesty. Always, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Always," Damien agreed, pulling her into a careful embrace, one that Elena, this time, did not hesitate to fully return. As they stood together on the terrace, the sounds of the gala drifting softly around them, Elena reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate flight through a side door 3 years earlier, through the quiet, transformative years in Ashford, to this second, deliberate choice made freely and without fear. She thought of Charlotte, who had opened her door without a single question that first desperate morning. She thought of Grace, who had seen potential in a heartbroken waitress and helped set her on a new path. She thought of Claire, whose faith in her abilities had eventually led her back to this very city and to this very moment. None of it had been easy. None of it had been guaranteed, but standing here now, with a ring on her finger that represented genuine partnership rather than obligation, Elena understood, more clearly than she ever had before, that sometimes the hardest choices, the ones that require us to walk away from everything familiar, are exactly what prepare us to recognize and fully embrace the right choice when it finally, truly arrives. Damien took her hand, and together, they walked back into the warm glow of the ballroom, no longer a runaway bride and the groom she had left behind, but two equals, choosing each other freely, with open eyes and honest hearts, ready to build a future neither business arrangements nor old fears would ever again threaten to undermine.